Berlin, the morning of December 30th, 1940. General Franz Halder sits in his office at Army High Command, reviewing intelligence from America. A transcript of Roosevelt's fireside chat from the previous evening lies on his desk. The American president has declared his nation will become the great arsenal of democracy. Halder reads the production targets: 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 18 million tons of merchant shipping, all within 2 years. He reads the numbers again, then reaches for his diary and writes a single word: propaganda. 3 floors above, Adolf Hitler receives the same report. His advisors surround him, men who understand industrial capacity. They tell him what he already believes. The numbers are impossible. American aircraft production in 1939 barely exceeded 3,000 planes per year. Roosevelt's targets represent an increase of more than 6,000%. It is, they assure him, typical American exaggeration designed to bolster British morale. The Führer nods. He has seen Hollywood films. He knows about American salesmanship. This is more of the same. Just bigger numbers, louder promises. What Hitler doesn't know is that every word of Roosevelt's speech is deadly serious. And over the next 4 years, those impossible numbers will not only be met, they will be exceeded by margins that will reshape the material balance of the entire war. This is the story of how Nazi Germany fatally underestimated American industrial capacity, how Hitler dismissed Roosevelt's promises as propaganda, and how that miscalculation would help seal Germany's fate before a single American soldier set foot on European soil. If you want to support our work in bringing these untold stories to life, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. To understand Hitler's reaction, we must first understand what Germany believed about America in December 1940. The view from Berlin was dismissive, shaped by ideology and strategic blindness. German intelligence assessments correctly identified America's vast resources, its enormous population of 130 million, its continental scale. But they fundamentally misunderstood what those advantages meant for war-making potential. Reports compiled by the Abwehr described the United States as weakened by internal divisions, a society corrupted by racial mixing, a democracy paralyzed by Jewish influence, a military ranking 18th in the world, smaller than Romania's, a population grown soft through decades of peace. These weren't random prejudices. They were systematic analyses filtered through Nazi ideology. The Germans looked at America's diversity and saw weakness. They looked at democratic debates and saw paralysis. They looked at isolationist sentiment and saw a nation that would never fight. Hitler had personal reasons to dismiss American military potential. He'd studied World War I extensively. America had entered late, fought for only 19 months, suffered relatively light casualties. It had delivered the final push against an already exhausted Germany, then claimed credit for victory. This time would be different. Lightning War would bring swift victories before America could mobilize. Even if Roosevelt overcame isolationist opposition, he would arrive too late. But there was a deeper problem in German analysis. Hitler and his advisors genuinely didn't believe American industry could be rapidly converted to war production on the scale Roosevelt described. In 1939, total American military aircraft production was approximately 3,000 planes. For Roosevelt to promise 185,000 aircraft in 2 years required an expansion so massive it seemed to defy economic logic. Where would the factories come from? The machine tools? The trained workers? German economic planners had spent 7 years building Nazi Germany's war economy through meticulous central planning. They believed they understood industrial mobilization. It took time, careful coordination, sacrifice from the civilian population. Converting automobile factories to build tanks and aircraft, training workers in new skills, reorganizing supply chains, all of this would take years, not months. Or so they believed. In reality, what Hitler's advisors were witnessing was the awakening of something they'd never encountered: American mass production applied to warfare. The very qualities they dismissed as weaknesses were about to become the foundation of the most powerful war economy in history. Henry Ford had spent decades perfecting assembly line production. William Knudsen understood mass production at a scale that made German industry look artisanal. Albert Kahn had pioneered factory designs that could be built and modified rapidly. These men were about to turn Roosevelt's promises into reality. But in December 1940, Hitler saw only American bombast. The speech itself had been carefully crafted. Roosevelt spoke for 37 minutes on the evening of December 29 from the White House. 75% of Americans either heard it live or read it the next day. Roosevelt began with reassurance. This is not a fireside chat on war. It is a talk on national security. He knew his audience, their fears about another European war, the power of isolationist sentiment. Then he pivoted. Nazi Germany aimed not just at European conquest but world domination. He detailed the fall of France, the occupation of Norway and Denmark and the Netherlands and Belgium. He described the Battle of Britain, still underway. If Britain fell, the United States would face a hostile totalitarian empire. His solution: America would become the great arsenal of democracy. Not by sending troops, but by unleashing American industrial capacity. Planes, tanks, ships, ammunition produced in American factories and shipped across the Atlantic. The production targets were staggering. 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, 18 million tons of merchant shipping, all within 24 months. In Berlin, the reaction was contempt. Hitler's view of Roosevelt was deeply ideological. He saw the president as a tool of what Nazis called the World Jewish Conspiracy. Roosevelt, wheelchair-bound from polio, was portrayed in German propaganda as physically weak, representative of a decadent democracy. Beyond ideological contempt lay fundamental strategic miscalculation. Hitler believed he had time. His war was going extraordinarily well. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks. Norway and Denmark in 2 months. The Netherlands in 5 days. Belgium in 18 days. France had collapsed in 6 weeks. By December 1940, Germany dominated continental Europe. Britain stood alone, subjected to nightly bombing. Even if American factories somehow met these production targets, they would arrive too late. Britain would fall before American aid could make a difference. This confidence was shared throughout the German High Command. The Wehrmacht had just completed the most successful military campaigns in modern history. Against this record, what did it matter if Roosevelt promised tanks and planes? What Hitler failed to understand was that Roosevelt's speech marked a fundamental shift not in intentions but in capabilities. The machinery to fulfill those promises was already being assembled. 9 days before the speech, Roosevelt had established a new organization to direct munitions production. William Knudsen was brought in as director of production. His job was to coordinate between government and industry, to unleash American manufacturing capacity. Knudsen understood something the Germans didn't. American industry didn't need years of careful central planning. It needed contracts, specifications, and freedom to solve production problems through competition and innovation. The American approach was radically different from German methods. Instead of a few large state-controlled factories, America mobilized thousands of independent companies. Instead of detailed 5-year plans, it relied on market mechanisms. Instead of forcing sacrifice on civilians, it expanded production so rapidly that military and civilian needs could both be met. This was economic mobilization on unprecedented scale. And it was invisible to German intelligence because it didn't fit their model of how war economies worked. In early 1941, as the Lend-Lease Act made its way through Congress, German intelligence tried to assess American potential. They acknowledged America's size and resources, but they consistently underestimated how quickly that potential could be mobilized. Part of this failure stemmed from cultural contempt. Nazi ideology taught that racially mixed societies were inherently inferior. How could America match the efficiency of racially pure Greater Germany? The irony was that America's diversity was strength, not weakness. Immigrant engineers brought knowledge from around the world. Women entering the workforce doubled the available labor pool. The same qualities Nazis saw as racial degeneracy turned out to be sources of innovation and resilience. The Lend-Lease debate consumed Congress for 2 months. Isolationists argued the act would lead to war. But public opinion was shifting. The bill passed the House on February 8 by 260 to 165. It passed the Senate on March 8 by 60 to 31. Roosevelt signed it on March 11, 1941. In Germany, Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop called this tantamount to a declaration of war. But still, they didn't believe the production promises would be fulfilled. They would soon discover how wrong they were. The machinery began turning before most Germans knew it existed. In January 1941, construction crews in Michigan broke ground on a factory that would become a symbol of everything Germany had miscalculated. Willow Run. 3.5 million square feet of factory space. An assembly line over a mile long. Designed to build B-24 Liberator bombers using the same mass production techniques Henry Ford had perfected for automobiles. The scale was unprecedented. The largest enclosed space ever constructed. German intelligence had no knowledge of its construction. Even if they had, they would have dismissed it. Aircraft couldn't be mass-produced like cars. Each plane required thousands of man-hours of skilled labor, precise hand-fitting of components, expert craftsmanship. But the Germans were thinking about aircraft production the way they always had. The Americans were inventing an entirely new approach. By mid-1941, contracts were flooding American manufacturers. Not just traditional defense contractors, but automobile companies, refrigerator makers, furniture manufacturers. Any company with metalworking capability was approached. The answer was almost always yes. The conversion happened faster than anyone thought possible. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant went from groundbreaking to tank production in just 9 months. The facility could produce more than 1,000 M3 Grant tanks per month by late 1942. Willow Run faced early challenges. The B-24 was vastly more complex than any automobile. 450,000 parts. 360,000 rivets. Early production was plagued with problems. Critics called it "Will it run?" But Ford engineers were learning. They broke the bomber down into subassemblies. They developed specialized tools that allowed less skilled workers to perform tasks that previously required master craftsmen. They created training programs that could turn farmers' daughters into precision riveters in weeks. By 1944, Willow Run had hit its stride. 1 B-24 every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak production in April 1944, the plant built 428 bombers. In that single month, Ford produced more heavy bombers than Germany had built in all of 1941. And Willow Run was just one factory. The numbers were staggering. In 1941, American aircraft production reached 26,000 planes. In 1942, 47,000. In 1943, 85,000. In 1944, 96,000. Germany's total aircraft production in 1944, after 5 years of total war mobilization, was 39,000 planes. Japan produced 28,000. The United States alone was building more aircraft than all Axis powers combined. American tank output went from 331 tanks in 1940 to 29,497 in 1943. Germany produced 27,000 tanks in 1943. At Boeing, man-hours required to build a B-17 Flying Fortress dropped from 142,800 hours to 15,300 hours. An 89% reduction while production volume increased by orders of magnitude. This was the industrial mobilization Hitler had dismissed as propaganda. The Arsenal of Democracy speech had promised 185,000 aircraft. The final total by war's end was nearly 300,000. Almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the entire war. Henry Kaiser's shipyards produced Liberty ships at rates that defied belief. The first Liberty ship took 230 days to build. By 1943, construction time averaged 42 days. One ship, the Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days and 15 hours. American shipyards produced approximately 5,600 cargo ships, 80,000 landing craft, 2.4 million trucks, 2.6 million machine guns, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. and German soldiers were about to encounter it firsthand. The first major clash came in North Africa in November 1942. Operation Torch brought 35,000 American troops into contact with Axis forces. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German forces under Rommel inflicted a sharp defeat on inexperienced American units. German officers felt their assumptions confirmed. American soldiers lacked experience and tactical skill. But what the Germans noticed was the sheer abundance of American equipment. Even in defeat, American units had supplies German forces could only dream of. Every soldier had his own rifle, helmet, uniform. Vehicles were plentiful. Ammunition was expended freely. Food rations included cigarettes, candy, coffee. Obergreiter Klaus Hartmann, captured near Tunis in May 1943, was processed through a prisoner collection point. What he saw there shook his understanding of the war. Trucks everywhere. Not just a few carefully husbanded vehicles, but dozens, hundreds of trucks moving supplies, transporting prisoners, hauling equipment. In 2 years with the Afrika Korps, Hartmann had seen German units immobilized for lack of fuel. He'd watched mechanics cannibalize 3 broken vehicles to create 1 working truck. And here were the Americans with more vehicles than he'd seen in his entire military career. The food was equally stunning. American rations included meat, vegetables, bread, fruit, real coffee, chocolate bars. One guard offered him a Hershey bar. Hartmann had tasted chocolate exactly twice since 1939. Now this American was giving it away as casually as offering water. Over 425,000 German soldiers would eventually be held in American prison camps. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker, captured in Tunisia, was sent to a camp in Michigan. The train journey took him through a landscape untouched by war. Cities intact, lights blazing at night, factories running at full capacity. At the camp, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Guards were well-fed, well-equipped, relaxed. They had so much equipment they could afford to be casual. Rifles left leaning against walls. Vehicles parked carelessly. Uniforms that weren't patched because new ones were readily available. Prisoners were fed better than German combat troops in the field. German prisoners working on American farms encountered material abundance on a scale they'd never imagined. Farmers owned multiple tractors. Barns filled with equipment. Fields stretched to the horizon, worked by machines. One prisoner watched a farmer mention buying a second truck. In Germany, civilians couldn't own trucks. The military requisitioned everything. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Nearly 500,000 men supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. American artillery batteries fired more shells in single bombardments than German factories could produce in weeks. Gefreiter Anton Müller, defending positions south of Rome in early 1944, watched an American artillery preparation and felt despair. The bombardment lasted 2 hours. Thousands of shells. The earth shook continuously. Trees shattered. Stone buildings reduced to rubble. Müller's unit had been rationing ammunition for weeks. Each soldier carried perhaps 50 rounds. Machine guns had a few hundred rounds each. And here were the Americans, expending ammunition like they had infinite supplies. They did have infinite supplies. American industrial production had reached a point where ammunition and equipment were being produced faster than they could be used. Storage depots overflowed. Ships waited at docks with no room to unload. This abundance fundamentally changed how American forces fought. They could use firepower to save lives. Why risk infantry when you could bombard the position first? German doctrine, developed under scarcity, emphasized tactical skill and economy of force. American doctrine, emerging from abundance, emphasized overwhelming firepower. The American supply system was a marvel. Supplies flowed from factories to docks to ships to forward depots to combat units with remarkable consistency. When equipment broke, it was replaced. When ammunition was expended, more arrived. Compared to the German system, which by 1944 was collapsing, it was miraculous. By late 1944, German intelligence could no longer deny American industrial dominance. But they still struggled to explain it. How had a decadent democracy outproduced the efficiently planned German war economy? The answer was that democracy and diversity were strengths. American industry was more efficient precisely because it wasn't centrally planned. Companies competed. Engineers innovated. Workers, many of them women and minorities entering the workforce for the first time, doubled the available labor pool. The qualities that Nazi ideology taught were weaknesses turned out to be tremendous strengths. But acknowledging this would require acknowledging that the entire foundation of National Socialism was built on lies. So German reports blamed Jewish control, plutocratic manipulation, anything except the obvious truth. That free societies with market economies could mobilize more effectively than totalitarian states. By 1945, German soldiers facing Americans knew they were fighting an enemy that would never run out of equipment, ammunition, or supplies. Every battle was mathematics with only one solution. You could fight skillfully, inflict casualties, defend tenaciously. But eventually American firepower would reduce your position to rubble. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers had been taught they were superior. But here they were, systematically defeated by an enemy that simply had more of everything. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, surrendering in April 1945, encountered American forces for the first time. He'd spent 4 years on the Eastern Front, where victories were earned through tactical excellence and brutal determination. Now, watching Americans advance, he saw a different kind of warfare. The Americans came with dozens of tanks, half-tracks filled with infantry, self-propelled artillery, engineers with bulldozers, all supported by aircraft that filled the sky. When resistance was encountered, they called in more firepower until resistance was eliminated. Steiner had seen the future back in 1940, when Roosevelt made his speech. Hitler had called it propaganda. German high command had dismissed it as impossible exaggeration. But Roosevelt had been telling the truth. Every word of it. America had become the arsenal of democracy. And that arsenal had built enough weapons to bury Nazi Germany under an avalanche of industrial output. The story of Hitler's dismissal of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy speech is a study in the fatal consequences of ideological blindness. Nazi Germany, confident in its military superiority and contemptuous of American capacity, made a series of assumptions that seemed logical within their worldview but were catastrophically wrong in reality. They assumed racial homogeneity was necessary for industrial efficiency. They assumed central planning was superior to market competition. They assumed democratic debate created weakness rather than strength. They assumed American production targets were propaganda rather than achievable goals. Every assumption was wrong. And by the time evidence accumulated to prove them wrong, it was too late. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. By war's end, the United States had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 88,000 landing craft, and billions of rounds of ammunition. This represented roughly 2/3 of all Allied military production during the war. Germany, despite years of preparation and total mobilization, was simply overwhelmed by material superiority it couldn't match and hadn't believed possible. The irony is profound. Hitler's Germany styled itself as the epitome of efficiency, discipline, and industrial prowess. Nazi propaganda endlessly proclaimed German technical superiority. And yet, when tested against American industrial capacity operating at full mobilization, German production was revealed as inadequate to the task. For German soldiers who survived the war, the memory of American material abundance remained vivid. In interviews conducted decades later, veterans consistently mentioned the shock of encountering American supplies. The trucks, the food, the ammunition, the casual waste of resources that German forces would have treasured. Obergreiter Hartmann, the soldier captured in Tunisia, gave an interview in 1978. Asked about his most lasting impression of American forces, he didn't mention tactics or courage or individual soldiers. He mentioned trucks. So many trucks, he said. More trucks than I'd ever imagined could exist. We fought for 3 years with barely enough transport. The Americans had trucks to waste. That's when I knew we'd lost. Not when I was captured. When I saw all those trucks. This material disparity wasn't just about numbers. It represented a fundamental difference in how societies organized for war. Nazi Germany's command economy, despite its apparent efficiency, was riddled with inefficiencies, competing bureaucracies, and ideological constraints that prevented optimal resource allocation. America's capitalist system, driven by profit incentives and competition, proved far more effective at rapidly scaling production. Companies competed for contracts. Engineers innovated to reduce costs and increase output. Workers, motivated by wages and patriotism, achieved productivity gains that centrally planned systems couldn't match. The lesson, clear in retrospect but invisible to Nazi leadership at the time, was that free societies mobilizing for existential war could outproduce totalitarian states. Democracy wasn't a weakness. It was a profound advantage. But Hitler never learned this lesson. Even as Germany crumbled around him in April 1945, he blamed defeat on betrayal, on Jewish conspiracies, on the weakness of the German people themselves. He never acknowledged that his fundamental assumptions about America had been catastrophically wrong. Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy speech, dismissed as propaganda in December 1940, had proven to be one of the most consequential statements of the war. Not because it threatened Germany militarily. America was still a year away from entering the war when the speech was delivered, but because it accurately forecast the industrial mobilization that would help crush the Axis powers. The speech was remarkable not for its rhetoric but for its honesty. Roosevelt wasn't bluffing. He wasn't exaggerating. He was telling Hitler and the world exactly what America was going to do. And then America did it. In the final accounting, Hitler's dismissal of American industrial capacity stands as one of the great strategic miscalculations of World War II. It stemmed from ideological contempt, from cultural blindness, from a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern industrial economies functioned. And it contributed directly to Germany's defeat. Not alone, the Soviet Union bore the brunt of German military power, and British resistance was crucial in the early years. But American production provided the material foundation for Allied victory. The tanks, the planes, the ships, the ammunition that kept Allied forces in the field. As Roosevelt promised. As Hitler dismissed. As history proved. If you found this exploration of one of history's most consequential miscalculations valuable, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others interested in the hidden turning points of World War II. These deep dives into the human psychology and strategic decisions behind the war help us understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and what we can learn from it today.